turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens.
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing
My name is Hilda Raz, and I live in Nebraska, teach at the University of Nebraska in the English department. I am in part of the creative writing program and teach poetry writing. I also am the editor-in-chief, now the Lushai editor-in-chief of the literary journal Prairie Schooner, now in its 77th year of continuous publication. I came to Nebraska in 1962 to work at the University of Nebraska, and although on 3 separate occasions I have seriously considered moving to other jobs, I have been so happy to remain here in this state and with Prairie Schooner. Yes, I went to school in Boston. I went to Boston University. I grew up in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York. So I had expected to come to the Midwest to go to college, actually to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. But for family reasons, I had to stay closer to home, and Boston sounded like a very big city that I wanted to see. So I applied to Boston University, was accepted, and it was my very good luck that Robert Lowell was teaching there. And as I went through Boston University, all the way through, I was able to attend for 2 years Robert Lowell's workshop. You were able to attend only with the permission of the instructor, and he read my work and liked it well enough to allow me to come into the workshop. I think when I first came to Lincoln, Nebraska, I came with a lot of fear. My mother at the time was sending me what she called packages of groceries, and they were just cardboard boxes filled with canned goods. I think she believed that I had abandoned civilization to come to a state she'd never visited. But you know, her feeling about Nebraska was very provincial. We know that now. When I came to Nebraska for the first time, I drove to the horizon. I had a small child, a 9-month-old son, John, and I left him at home with his father and went to the edge of town. And when I arrived, I felt I'd come to a place I could live for the rest of my life. The landscape was uncomplicated in ways that soothed me, and the richness had to do with color and texture, so I felt alive in ways I had never been before. I've loved Nebraska all these years. I also feel that my work responds very much to the uninterrupted vision that the literal seeing that you can do at the horizon, but also a sense of the vision of place, frontier, the cutting edge, if you will. Of course, we're very sophisticated now. Well, certainly Robert Lowell was a great influence, and the students who had been in his writing workshop not very much before I was, Anne Sexton, for example. I attended Anne Sexton's first reading at Boston University. She was not part of the writing workshop. She had just left it, and Sylvia Plath just before Anne. So the new ways in which they were writing and Lowell's own response to their writing influenced me most particularly. I'd been reading T.S. Eliot, as we all had, but Lowell's decision to bring poems into his own poems into the workshop that were based on his life and the furniture of his life. He would write about the car that he was driving, for example, or Harriet, his child, would be very much a part of the poem. And I learned, or I later came to believe that Lowell's own work loosened as a result of Anne Sexton's work and Sylvia Plath's. He was the first and most important influence. Of course, I have a myriad of names I might cite from school teachers and friends. The influence I felt most keenly in my personal life has been Bernice Sloats. Bernice was editor of Prairie Schooner and my mentor. She is the person who taught me what I needed to know about editing Prairie Schooner, although she was then the editor. I watched her. I understood how distinguished her mind and how passionate her interests, her literary interests, and how graceful and responsible her relationship with her students. So certainly she has been my chief inspiration. Susan Rozowski, two Cather scholars. Susan Rozowski has been a very good friend to my work and to me, and certainly, although she is not a poet, certainly I've read her scholarly work over the years, her published work, with great admiration and feel deep affection for her and her work. All the poets we know, Marge Sizer has a particular influence on me and my work. Marge and I were writing partners for a significant amount of time. And although Marge has many different writing partners, I had only Marge, and so we would often meet and write together, read back and forth. I admire her work very much. I don't know yet that I'm a writer. I wonder when enough is enough to tell you that you deserve to call yourself a writer. My favorite actual button is one I picked up at a national meeting, and it says poet on it, and the typeface is old-timey typewriter type, and I wore that sort of daily to remind myself I was in fact a poet. So I don't think I've settled yet into being a writer. I have always, however, written. My earliest memories are writing on tablets with lines and trying to stay within the lines and knowing I wouldn't, and violating the taboo of the restraint on the page. Resistance has always been my attitude and posture in a way, which is, I think, a common occurrence for writers. I have an epigraph to a poem in Divine Honors, and it's from Kierkegaard, and it says pretty much, only when I write do I feel well. That's the case for me. I satisfy the need to write by writing. If I don't write, it's because I have so many other things to do that fulfill responsibilities to my life as a teacher, as an editor, as a friend, as a member of a family. And making that difficult negotiation is part of my job as a writer. Karen Shoemaker gave a reading last night, a wonderful reading from her most recent book of short fiction, and she said she hears voices. The voices tell her stories. I don't hear voices, but the events of the day compel me to respond. And one does not have so many friends to call up and rant to, or write a sestina to or with. And so I turn to the page. The page has always been my companion and friend. The assumptions behind language and the assumptions that language dictates and the way language shapes our thinking fascinate me. So language itself is my medium in the same way that a ceramicist uses clay or a painter uses visual media, chalk, pastels, pencil. I've just had the greatest luxury a writer can have. I've had 8 months leave, what's called a faculty development leave, in which I was not only given the privilege of behaving as a writer, but actually rewarded for doing so. And what I did, Joanna, for the happiest 8 months of my life was to wake up early at maybe 6:30, have some breakfast, put coffee into a thermos, and go to my desk. And I sat there until noon, and then I had lunch, and then I sat there from 1 until 3, and then I went for a walk, and then I sat there, and then I went to sleep. And I did this day after day after day with time off for family and shopping, grocery shopping, yes, and a little cooking, and then some travel for trans. I only traveled as a writer for no other reason. I only appeared in public as a poet, and no one asked me to do anything else. So it was wonderful. I'm surprised to see, as I grow older, a more cryptic language, a tighter language creeping into my poems. The lyric, I think, maybe at least for the nonce, is done. And I am more and more fascinated with a language that is a less narrative language, a less responsible to the reader stance, and a more opaque, maybe, style that perhaps I'm indulging for the minute in a way I will give up later. I'm always surprised that anyone reads my work at all. I don't have a particular audience. I can remember talking with my very close friend Hugh Luke, who was the editor of Prairie Schooner before I took over. And Hugh said that when he wrote, he always did have an audience in mind, an audience of one. And he always wrote in response to what we call the muse, that is some person whose interest in the work, maybe a maternal or a paternal figure, kept him on the page. But I can't imagine anybody ever being interested in my work. And I write it in the same way that the wood carver carves. Not decoys for a purpose, but because he carves. He carves, or she carves. The words of encouragement I might give come from my desk as editor. Prairie Schooner would fail. We would fail to thrive if beginning writers did not send their work for consideration for publication. And Prairie Schooner is only one of a myriad of journals in the country that needs the work of beginning and mid-career writers. It is these beginning and mid-career writers who stay with the magazine, who make the name of the magazine. We support their work, they support us. And if you want to write, I don't think anything can keep you from writing. You will write. And then remember, the second part of the contract is send out your work, because editors have no work to do. We are all fired if you don't send your work to us. We're waiting for it. I'm working now on a book of essays. Can you imagine any stranger change? But I have a subject that I want to explore in prose, and that is what I did on my leave. I wrote a very long piece of prose while I was in Portland, Oregon, and then I went to Nye Beach on the coast of Oregon, on the Pacific, and wrote some more. And then during the 8 months, I shaped that prose into 4 loosely formed essays, 3 of which are near to being complete, and the 4th is still a little loose. I also wrote 22 poems. I am a poet, and I find it difficult to write these prose containers for the material I have in mind. But I am doing that, and I hope to finish the book. I had hoped I would finish the book in 8 months, which is completely impossible. Although perhaps Janice Agee might finish a novel. She is, or a more practiced prose writer. But that is my next project, a book of essays called What Becomes You. What I feel proud about is that I was editor-in-chief at the time Prairie Schooner celebrated its 75th anniversary with a conference and celebration that brought 750 people to the Cornhusker Hotel, many of them not only from out of town, out of state, but also out of country. And that Joyce Carol Oates, who published her work very early in her career and before I came to Prairie Schooner, but whose work I followed very closely as submissions to Prairie Schooner and discussed at length with Bernice Slout, so that she became, as Amy Clampett did, when I was working with Bernice, for Bernice really, there were certain writers I felt were my writers, and she would always turn over from the mail these manuscripts, and I would read them, and she simply allowed me to accept what I wanted, and Joyce Carol Oates was one of these. So here is Joyce Carol Oates, the speaker at our the keynote speaker at our 75th anniversary, and a panel of distinguished Oates scholars, some of whom came from abroad. Oates wrote a letter later to us saying that the panel had the best criticism of her work of any she had ever seen or read about. And then Joyce Carol Oates' biographer was here also, a wonderful fiction writer as well, and he talked about Oates in the process of writing the biography and read some of his work. And we had many keynote speakers, but I was there, and Harvey Perlman was there, and Rick Edwards was there, and distinguished Linda Pratt, chair of the English department, whose support has made all the difference for Prairie Schooner all these years. And Glenn Alushai was there to announce, with Susan Norby of the University of Nebraska Foundation, the endowment of Prairie Schooner and its editor with a great philanthropic gift of $500,000. And we had a grand party with flowers at the University of Nebraska Press, and many dinners, and lots of delightful times with writers we'd never met before, but whose work we've published and depend on.
Good evening. My name is Joanna Lloyd, and I am curator of the Heritage Room. I want to welcome you to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska authors and the John H. Ames reading series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by or about Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 12,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 published authors from Nebraska. In one way of promoting these authors, the Heritage Room sponsors the John H. Ames reading series. This is our 140th Ames reading. We feel established. I would like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like these. You should feel that you can come in to visit our collection during regular public service hours for group or individual tours, or to enjoy the Heritage Room as a reading room where anyone who is interested can come in and read from our collection. Our reader tonight is Hilda Raz, distinguished poet, professor of English at UNL, and editor-in-chief of the literary magazine, The Prairie Schooner, which has been published continuously since 1927, a longevity rarely achieved by literary magazines. Raz studied poetry at Boston University with Robert Lowell. Lowell was the first 20th century poet to have drawn poetry from his life. At an earlier reading of poetry from Trans, a woman in the audience commented, "This is a mother's poetry." But Hilda nodded gravely and said something like, "No, it's the complexity of the poet." Hilda has been honored with scholarships, fellowships, prizes, and in the regard that she inspires in her readers. She came to Nebraska in 1964 and has stayed. Let me introduce you to Hilda Raz.
I'm so proud to be here tonight and to see friends and students with me. This is the third time I've read at the Heritage Room, and somewhere on a shelf there is film of me in my youth, in my middle age, and now as I approach my prime. Thank you for coming to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room, and a special thanks to curator Joanna Lloyd, whom I've known for years as a brilliant scholar and a friend of my work and of Prairie Schooner. My recent book, Trans, takes its name from a prefix, a word meaningless unless attached to another word. I was thinking most particularly when I wrote the book of transgress, transform, transport, transcribe, and transcend. The book has 2 epigraphs, one set from the Oxford English Dictionary, the 4 meanings of trans as they define them, and each section of the book uses one of these meanings to elucidate the text. The other is a poem I'd like to read now as an invocation and a blessing on tonight's gathering. What survives? Who says that all must vanish? Who knows, perhaps the flight of the bird you wound remains, and perhaps flowers survive caresses in us in their ground. It isn't the gesture that lasts, but it dresses you again in gold armor from breast to knee, and the battle was so pure, an angel wears it after you. And that, of course, is Rilke. I made the mistake tonight of listening to the news. I don't recommend that you do so, but I did. We live in interesting times. And although I hadn't planned to do so, I'd like to begin with a poem I wrote a long time ago from the chapbook that's called The Bone Dish. Since the poetry I'm going to read tonight is very much about the language of which it's constructed, this poem is called Words. Words. Deft and dexterous its sister are some so defined. Meanwhile the air glisters. No, that is water in the distance, a warm bowl beckoning. We are alive, hurrah, unlike some precious others, and others still anonymous, whose life's work is done. How to enjoy the moment then, the salve of breath unnoticed, and grief waving its handkerchief from behind a holly bush? Or the ones gone, whose warm skin nightly becomes an embrace so habitual as to be painful? We push them away, those we most want. Orphans, women stranded at the front, figures holding aloft other figures, alive, human in ruins, rubble of human waste at their feet. We grieve so quietly. How can we live properly? I'm always interested in how language can change war, absence, civil or personal atrocity. Do you have the answer? I don't. Come and sit. I'll read a little bit from Divine Honors, and then, from Trans, and then a few poems from Divine Honors, and then I'll be here to answer questions if you'd like to ask some, I hope. This poem I have never read out loud before, but while I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, I was interviewed on the radio, and the interviewer, a woman, very talented writer named Kristen Naka, asked me to read this poem before we went on the air, and I said, oh, no, not really. And she said, oh, yes, really. So I did, and read it carefully and slowly and talked a little bit about the way the poem was written, and the audience called in and seemed to like it, like my reading of the poem. So here is a poem called Avoidance. Avoidance, a verb made into a noun. My students who are here tonight know that I ask them to avoid such constructions. But avoidance is what I felt was important to me as I sat down to begin the poems that I knew would be the book called Trans, Avoidance. This is a prose poem that's packed with diversions. Everywhere I'm trying to avoid getting to what I want to say. Today, I'd like to write about epistemology, or quarks, the habits of the leech, so useful in medical treatment a horror in the pond. The growth and development of the precious embryo attended, monitored until the radiance and blood of birth. The crash of hardwood cultivated for lumber, delight as oak falls through undergrowth, the whine of the saw, the layers peeling off into fans, falling through their own fragrance to muslin pallets, dust in the chilly air raising a grit halo. Or the blurble coffee falls from into the cup as you pour a refill, all paid for, earned, the morning deserved, the back seat of the car piled with book bags, their bright canvas a rainbow of good work done, evening hours invested, the lucky deposit on cabins in the Maine woods, moose, ponds, gravel paths, and in the near distance, the salt, the crash of an ocean contained by its verge of rock. So consider the weight of the child in his mother's arms, the reds and yellows of the photos, the leisurely flow of language, no compression, nothing packed or forced, no attempt to move in, no microcosm, macrocosm, no abstractions tied into the concrete, no natural paths sealed over to retain or meander, no wretched friends to accompany on their final walks. Consider the tick, then, veinless, says the biologist in the deep voice of the woman he was. Useful as a figure for survival, researchers crush them in vices under tons of pressure in sealed hermetic chambers devoid of air, pumped free of all essentials. And the tick scurries out alive, cheerful, the size of a grape. We all shudder, down to the last woman at this table of learning, old friends all, colleagues. What to make of our profiles, age, religious preference, marital history, hobbies, our experience with Hale Bopp? Did we see the comet at all? Note its tail as what? When I wrote that poem, I was packing everything into it that I possibly could get. I was pushing with my elbow to put it all into this poem, and yet a poem of divergence, of diversion, of avoidance, has all of the images, all of the image clusters and structures that inform the whole book. Where did that come from? Beats me, beats me. The next poem is called Tough. It's a voice poem. You'll hear my mother's voice in it and mine. The only gloss I think that I need to make is ad astra per aspera is a Latin phrase that means to the stars through technology. To the stars through technology. Tough, tough, says Mom, that's tough. My list of near escapes, excuses for late homework, curfews, periods. Really, Mom, I say, I can't. Tough luck, tough turkey. I do it, wash the car, run to the store, shine my shoes, finish my math, finish my Latin, ad astra per aspera, brush my teeth, tough it out, the bad back, the alterations, the droops and tucks, the altercations, war, the political party, mayhem, tough titty, tough luck, tough chance, too bad. The tough steak breaks down in a marinade of vinegar and spices. The muscles give way, acid, a broth of change, flavor. Ah, but under the teeth, delicious resistance. Melts in the mouth, says Aunt Anne, grinning at us. 3 nieces in lawn dresses eating cream puffs in a hot New York deli. When I finished reading that poem on the air, I realized the missing word, and I like to often refer to what is missing with the shadow. The word that is missing is salmonella. I still shudder when I think about eating those cream puffs in a delicatessen without air conditioning. Of course, tough resistance is what I am offering myself and my voice through the entire book. Tough resistance. A little poem about teaching. Have you ever hit your fingernail with a hammer or run full tilt into a wall barefoot? Then you know what happens. Bleeding begins under the nail, and there is no succor to be had except by drilling a hole in the nail, or as I call it, the carapace. The questions of calling, of naming, come up in our class again and again. And this poem is called Secrets. Teach me, they say, the women with childbirth 3 months behind them, one with a dead baby in tears, the other come an hour down the highway to find her car towed, her shirt front wet with milk, and no money in her pocket. Teach me, says Ruth, whose secret is identity, pale face, but she a blooded Sioux. And Amy, muscular dystrophy, who says, no, you can't, when she doesn't show up for class. Teach me, says the toe, leaking blood under the nail. Teach me, says the rigid carapace, solid, sealed on all sides, so the pulse amplifies, stirs as currents of fire in the toe. Teach me, babbles the darning needle or the drill in its pan of water, burning over, settling on the stove. And my job, to scald, bore, hold steady under the light, the singe, the push, the steady pressure, eyes open, the flash, the bubble of blood, the maroon gush, the icy relief. Teach me, says the hole in the nail, tiny a door, and around it rust, mold, acrid release of what's sealed, a tender probe to open, to hurt. In class, we've been talking about Ars Poetica, the poems that talk about reasons for writing, why we write. I think that poem might be my Ars Poetica, although it is a poem about teaching. Here's another poem I'd not read before, but read out loud. But I did read it, and I think all you need to know about this poem is the time. It's early morning. Writing partners, 2 women, are sitting in a booth at the Village Inn. And later, alone in my kitchen, I'm making dinner. And these 2 scenes flip in and out. I want to identify the writing partner who's present in this poem as Marge Sizer. Someday maybe I can persuade Marge to do a reading together in which we read back and forth to each other the poems that we generated. And while Marge has many writing partners, she is my only writing partner. This is called Prelude. We bring to our booth pages packed full of subject and verb, blood and tissue, the nutshells of her history sharp under her elbow as she leans hard, the full weight of her language on this vision or that one, and take in the full length of our throats, swallowing, breathing air we share with 50 others, the smells of ripening toast in the chrome slots, and we breathe out, tone, shading, the shouts necessary for our Monday morning before light streaks the sky, before the curtains close against the glare for patrons in the next booth, and the whole world opens. For weeks, staticky news over the sink as each night at the open refrigerator I transport, unwrap, scrub, pare, and transform food for the family body. O child God who pushes across the glass tabletop the sharp clatter, the ruckus of our lives, blocks of Legos, steel gas tubes torn across at the throat by some torque from a machine too terrible to posit now at this table rinsed by the kind and disinfectant cloth. Trained by custom to serve, I set down the burden of dinner, wash my hands, and begin to eat. The only possibility, finally, turning away from the heat. Reliable torque of hip socket and ribs allowing the swivel my body makes to sit down. Or reach for the phone, gut courage to climb on the plane, transfer, hoisting luggage into the overhead bins, and arrive at your side, child, in time for your long surgery to come tomorrow. And I'll be there, your mother, where I belong. The old miracle of your birth, belief enough to see us through, cut and clamp, the blood price I signed to pay, and will myself onto the plane with books and cash, pasties, ribbons, cashmere socks, spare eyeglasses, and ribs, hip bones, reliable bone sockets, and every recipe intact or documented, soft sacks bathed, reliable tongue tucked up into the silence broken by only one word, love, one phrase, you can, one other, I'm here, child, your absolute company, as you are changed radically from one thing to another. I'm getting down to it. And now those of you who have heard me read before know that the narrative occasion for the writing of trans, it was an event that among the trans word is the word transsexual, and that my daughter Sarah, who had been my daughter for 30 years, at 30 became my son Aaron, in the usual ways that people change gender now through technology, ad astra per aspera. Without technology, we would not have the opportunity for congruence between the sensed gender of the self and the body that might be the same. Although Judith Butler talks about a spectrum of gender, and that is an interesting idea to talk about. In fact, in trans, the binary against which I have so much resistance is everywhere attacked by the poems and by the structure of the poems against the binary, the tremendous resistance against that. So that's the subtext of the thinker at work using language to engage the problem. But here, to be fair, here is Aaron himself on the page. Aaron is, as Sarah was, a maker. In this poem, he is a maker of masks. He is making masks. The hypodermic needle he uses, in this poem, he uses for his testosterone injections, not for drugs, for other drugs, and he must use testosterone for the rest of his life. So, this is Aaron at work / rain. In Divine Honors, I began to interrupt the page with scars, the slashes that announce multiple titles, because Divine Honors is about many things, but one of the things it's about is breast cancer. And I wanted the body of the text to be scarred and interrupted in the same way the body is interrupted by treatment. So this is Aaron at work, rain. By the light box propped in the window, bare-chested, scars rosy in artificial sun, he crouches over his workbench. Dental tools in their holder at hand, silver discs, his torch, the tiny saw. Light flares, breaks on his earring as he turns his head frowns, dark eyebrows almost meeting. He takes a watch from his jeans pocket, rubs it absently over his beard, electricity. The braid clinks its beads as his head turns, reading something. Now he rises, goes to the cupboard, mixes wallpaper paste with water. The pile of miraculous papers, shot metal, threaded with linen, he sorts to start a papier-mâché hypodermic needle he's building on the table. Matches to the real one he used this morning, adds it as a detail to the mask to change the meaning, a revolution, what he's about. Out the window, the black car beads up rain. He never drives it. An emblem, but of what? A memory of pain, his slouching walk just home from hospital? Where is the child whose shoes I bought? Where's the bread we needed? Where's our kitchen? Our dead? Poor Erin was such an angry mother. Okay. If we have time, I'll come back to the last poem in the book, which is called The Funeral of X, Who Was Y's Mother. The Funeral of X, Who Was Y's Mother. A poem I wrote for Brenda Friedman Ingraham, whose grandchild was born today. And I thought I would, although of course she's busy. Her granddaughter is named Nina Tova Isabella. Nina Tova Isabella. But let's look a little bit at divine honors. This poem is called Isaac Stern's Performance, and those of you who have heard me read this before. I often read it, but it has just been released to Johns Hopkins Medical Center for use on their web, and I think the only gloss here is Pierre Rampal, who speaks in the middle of the poem, is a great flautist, and he's talking about Isaac Stern's performance. Isaac Stern, the great conductor. Here plants, gold and dry, rustle up green at soil's edge. Music roils in the room where I wait, my chest holding even at the scar's edge. Whatever chances I took paid off, and now I have only the rest of my life to consider. Once it was a globe, an ocean to cross, at least a desert. Now a rivulet or a blowhole. I remember it was like a story, Rampal said on the radio. He was telling you the Beethoven concerto. I am telling you cancer. I am telling you as moisture at soil's edge after winter, or the bulb of the amaryllis you brought, raising stem after stem from cork, dirt, one hybrid flower after another unfurling for hours, each copper petal opening its throat so slowly, each shudder of tone, mahogany, coral, blood, an ache, climax, agony, life. In the cancer poems, my objection was, as I came to understand it, was to the language of disease. Susan Sontag, of course, talked about illness as metaphor, but the language of cancer is itself toxic, and the idea of cells run rampant, like kudzu, is not a helpful construct for anyone. In fact, cancer is a hybrid in the same way this amaryllis is, and the changes at the cellular level account for much beauty in the world, and I wanted that amaryllis in its slow unfolding to stand for an alternative way of reading cancer, in the same way a composer can tell you a concerto, and another musician can report this on the radio. Okay. Have a few more minutes, and I'd like to read some new work. Have to decide what I feel brave enough to read. Okay. This poem is a kind of nonce poem. It's called Failures. Failures in couplets. One shoe, the other gone, found later in a nest of lint in the bushes. Blind from migraine, what's that raw noise? Only small dials on the radio, all 6 levers. Out to lunch, friends talk, her daddy's in despair. I try for words. What luck, a father, and she 50. Early morning sounds, someone sick? I flee to the kitchen. You're making coffee. A door is open, I look in, they're gone. A student says, you look so tired. I go home, alone. So much work, how about a road trip? Of course I'll go, read in the car, bad companion. Cold outdoors, heavy clothes, all cotton, lighter near the window. Indoors, we shiver. Chairs for sale, on the committee, friends, all peers, old sitters, new seats. A list of failures. Okay. And one that was just taken by Portrait de Saul, very weird poem. It's called Round Square, back to the binary and the slashes. Its epigraph is, if you're born round, you won't die square. Boxing announcer on TV. Born round, cut ties in Rome. Born heavy, breathe out. Boon to none, boon to self. Burst or swell. Broken. That's the ticket into the thicket. Be as you are, be hungry. Enter, sit down, fall into the page. Be right here, gray and gray. Gravy at the corner, mop it up. Turn on the faucet. Wrists hurt, knees stuck, brains aloft, lofty. Lifted to the window, clouds, cloudy. Hungry, breathe it. Jettison history, what comes next is nexus. Never mind silence, something's always the end. We're talking a little bit about forms in class, and Grace Bowers in the audience has just written a fabulous ghazal. Ghazal is a Persian form with very rigid rules, and the only one I think I'll mention, if you wait a minute, is that in the penultimate line, the second last line, your name has to appear. And the name Raz means literally miracle with a secret at the heart. Miracle with a secret at the heart. This is for her, a ghazal. The season turns at last. You ask a question, why last? The ginkgo resists snow's burden. No matter what, limbs bow at last. Trees crack. Yesterday you made a hard visit. After surgery, morphine stitches out at last. Silence is news. In the sink, signs of sustenance. Signs ask, does life transfer at the last? Bodies in bed take such a small space. We will be given away, 2 sticks at last. or go fast alone, some miracle. The sky is dark. Now morning. What's left? You, alive, at last. And one more poem. This is a very short riddle poem. We've been looking at riddle poems in which the subject is immersed, submerged, and you learn the answer to the riddle in various ways, but never through the poem. And of course, the riddle is the beginning of a metaphor. And this is just called at the moment riddle. Cover me to cover you, I know I'm important. Pearl or glittery shell or derivative. Sometimes I masquerade as fruit. Sometimes I'm dropped off, no fault of mine, onto the floor. How well you search for me depends on my place or worth. Am I replaceable, impatient? Do you hold my sister, my brother? Ownership, relationships, and buttons. Okay. I'll read, should I read to close? I'll read the poem for Brenda. The Funeral of X, Who Was Y's Mother. This poem has a shadow of the Holocaust in it, the shadow of the Holocaust. This woman who died last night in her daughter's arms, saying thank you to whom? God for the easy death called the kiss, which the rabbi tells us is God's blessing, the touch of his lips to forehead that withdraws the divine spark, life from the body? Or thank you to her daughter, most blessed by this witness, who wonders aloud which meaning, a question in my ear as I bend down to her. You deserve thanks, I say, either way, and we laugh at the courtesy of her mother, who died during spring break, so I shouldn't have to miss classes. Shekinah, the holy part of God that as woman we are told, so a child, the rabbi says, leapt to his feet at her footsteps in order to honor the divine spirit within her. He grew to be honored, but this mother, her price was above precious gems. She was one of 6 surviving children of parents who had left behind in Europe 10 others, no reason given, but we know, counting the years backward. Will it never leave us, this grief, particular as sand we are told to brush off after the whirlwind abates? Each grain in the eye moves and scratches as I search the bowl of sky, horizon to horizon, for a sign of the lost. Each particular ash invisible. As she is within the daughter who remains with me in my arms, bent for news, whispered with deep delight that the final gift a parent gives, to die in a child's arms, is enough. We laugh and cry at once, which is seemly, while the mother of us all cries out and laughs, one part at best, and holds me as I bend to myself to discover not what I can't hope to understand, that which we are enjoined not to worry, fondle, turn over and over, but some small way into the magnificence, abundant and ever-moving, of the breathing and continuing flesh. Welcome, Brenda's grandchild. Thank you so much for being here.